Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Berg. Hi, welcome back to the podcast. I know it has been a bit Australian politics heavy lately, but I am doing it because it's really worth it. Obviously, the result was so cataclysmic, and now is a good time because there's a lot of players who were very on script and on message during the campaign, and now they're off script and willing to speak a little bit more candidly about what went wrong. But more importantly, how to fix the situation and how to rebuild the centre-right in Australia, perhaps in time for the next election, but probably more likely in 2 or 3 elections' time. One of those was my next guest, Senator James Paterson. He was the campaign's coalition spokesman throughout the campaign, but he has really become a bit of a de facto opposition leader over the last 3 years. He's impressed everybody. He's one of the few frontbenchers in the opposition who didn't serve in cabinet as government. And I think that really showed because he was out every single day for the last 3 years prosecuting the opposition's case. Now, obviously, that didn't work so well for the opposition because they're not in government and they lost very badly. But that's not really through any fault of Senator Paterson's. He had an almost flawless run over the last 3 years. And he's going to be a very significant figure in the Liberal Party for as long as he wants to be in federal parliament. So he sits in the Senate. He cannot run for the leadership or the prime ministership or anything like that. That makes him quite an influential figure. And I guess the best thing or the best way to think about Senator James Paterson is that he is on his way to being a right-wing power broker, I think. And so I'm very grateful to James for making some time for me to discuss the ins and outs of this campaign and what went wrong for the Liberals in Australia and how they can reclaim the fight. James Paterson, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
James, what day did you know that you had lost the federal election, and when did you know you had lost it so spectacularly?
I knew during the campaign that it wasn't going well. We certainly knew that between January and May, we'd lost a lot of support, that we'd gone backwards. But I still thought, as late as election day itself, that a bad result would be us picking up a handful of seats, maybe 4 or 5. It did not enter my mind as a possibility that we would be losing a dozen or more seats on election day. And it wasn't until the votes started coming in on election night, and particularly once we knew that there were bad results coming out of Dixon, Peter Dutton's electorate, that I realised just how bad a result it was going to be.
How did you get to that place? You're someone I think has pretty good political judgment, probably some of the better political judgment in that place. And I remember being quite puzzled, if not befuddled, by you guys constantly telling us on and off the record, it's okay, we're still on course for a good result. What was guiding your thinking?
I always knew that winning government was a hugely ambitious and difficult exercise, but I thought it was a reasonably realistic prospect that we could drag the government into minority government and potentially quite deep into minority government. And as late as January, the public opinion polls were indicating that that was the likeliest result from the election. The reason why we remained confident, even when the public polls turned south, is that our private internal polling remained very bullish. Now, it too recorded a drop in support, but it had us starting at a higher point, and it had our drop in the support more modestly than other polls. And so we still thought, as late as the night before the election, that we were in a strong position in those key seats around the country to get a good swing to us and pick up a number of seats, because that's what the polling was telling us.
Okay, that does explain a lot. So you're basically getting junk data and then making all sorts of decisions, not just in your public messaging and perhaps in some of your policy positions, but I imagine campaign resourcing decisions based on that junk polling. So who was doing that polling for you and how was it so spectacularly wrong? And were there any points in the campaign where you thought, why is this polling that we're getting so radically different to the public polling?
So it's a public fact that our polling was done by Freshwater, by Dr. Mike Turner, who had done polling for us in previous campaigns, including at the state level, and had performed very well in those elections. He was one of the most accurate pollsters in the Voice referendum and in some of the state elections in the lead up. So we had no reason to think that his polling would be anything other than accurate in this campaign. campaign. During the campaign, it was obvious to us that there was a divergence between the public polls and our internal private polls. And lots of discussion happened at campaign headquarters, where I was based, about the reasons for that gap in the polls. And whenever we asked questions about that, we were given seemingly very convincing explanations as to why the kind of polling that was being done for the campaign by Freshwater was far superior to the public polls. The media can't spend anywhere near as much money on polling as a political party can. Their polling relies on online panels, a sample from online panels that are then reweighted to try and match the demographics of Australia, whereas our polling through Freshwater was based primarily on phone canvassing, not only, but primarily, and that built the demographic model, as we were told, from the ground up to exactly match the Australian population demographics rather than just a weighting of an online panel of people. And so we were told for that reason it should be far more accurate. What I did not know, and I only learned after the campaign when reading the Financial Review on the Monday after the campaign, is that our polling also had at the heart of it an assumption about how someone who voted no in the Voice referendum but was a Labor voter would behave in this election. And had I known that, I would have asked a lot of questions about whether that was a reasonable assumption, but I was never told about that.
So, two things on that. Let's just deal firstly with the way you found out. You read it in the Financial Review. That was an opinion article that was penned by Dr. Mike Turner. Should he have told you guys that first before he put that in the public domain? Is that not poor form?
There is now post-campaign conjecture about who was told and who wasn't told and who knew and who didn't know. But as the coalition's campaign spokesman and the shadow minister in residence at campaign headquarters, who participated in those 5:30 a.m. phone calls where we were presented with the polling, I was never told, and other people that I've spoken to after the campaign who were in similarly senior positions also did not know. So yes, I think we should have been told, and we would have been able to interrogate that, and we would have able to maybe take some steps to make sure that the polling was reliable. Because the disastrous thing about relying on bad polling is, as you say, it not only leads you to misallocate resources that could be spent defending seats that it's turned out we lost, that we never knew were at risk, but it also does influence the policy agenda. It influences the policy agenda in more subtle ways than most people think it is. We don't set policy solely according to polling, but if polling tells you that working class Labor voters are about to depart the Labor Party en masse and you want to make sure that's happened, well, then you construct a policy agenda which appeals to people like that. And it turns out that was the wrong thing to do.
So, is there a future for Dr. Mike doing future Liberal Party polling, in your view?
Well, I'm a member of the parliamentary party. I don't have a say in choosing our future pollster, but yes, I'd be surprised if we use Freshwater in our next campaign.
Mm. So let's go back to The Voice. This seems to have really led the Liberals down the wrong path for quite some time now. Was it your view that Voice voters, and let's keep in mind what this question was, it was to create an unaccountable voice that nobody was very clear about what level of influence it would have over government policy, but ideally it would have a say of some sort over anything that affected Indigenous Australians. This idea was overwhelmingly rejected by Australians when it was put to a referendum by Labor. Did that defeat confuse yourself, your colleagues, into thinking that it said more about Australia's electoral situation than it actually did?
I'm very proud that we stood against the voice because it was wrong in principle and it was a very radical idea that could have had serious unintended consequences in the Constitution. But yes, I think some people on the centre right of Australian politics over-interpreted the consequences of the result. A Labor voter voting no to the voice did not necessarily mean that they would then follow up at the next federal election when very different questions were going to be on the ballot and turn around and vote for the Liberal Party. It meant that there was a window of opportunity for us to appeal to them. It meant that they might be willing to listen to us, but the idea that they were somehow guaranteed to walk over the line and vote for us was a heroic assumption that should have never been in the polling, that's for sure. I think it did cause political problems for the government because the main problem for them was it sent a perception to their own people that for the first 18 months of their government, they were concerned about a cultural issue or a symbolic issue when people were struggling to pay their mortgages or their rent or electricity bills. So it was a dangerous moment for the government. But in a funny way, Anthony Albanese was very lucky to have had the voice because it was the wake-up call that his government needed in the second half of the term that they had to do things completely differently. And to their credit, from that point on, they were ruthlessly focused on the cost of living in a way that we weren't. And they did claw back a lot of that support that they'd lost in the first half of their term.
I want to go back to something you said there when we were talking about the dodgy polling. You said that caused you to follow policies perhaps in more subtle ways, and that was looking at working class voters who might be considering deserting Labor, according to that faulty analysis. This also seems to me at the heart of your problem because this election we saw the Liberal Party and the coalition do some things I personally didn't think I'd ever see a coalition do. Some examples are turning your back on Ukraine, saying you wouldn't support a coalition of the willing, something that Andrew Hastie has now said in public that it was something he supported. He was the Shadow Defence Minister at the time. Another issue was you went to an election actually opposing a structural tax cut. I never thought I would see a day where the Liberals were opposing a tax cut and Labor was putting out on pamphlets that they were the party of lowering taxes. Didn't you confuse your own identity so much that you didn't know what you stood for? And that's really what the voters saw in you and Peter Dutton, and you were a very integral part of that leadership.
The short answer is yes, we confused our own supporters. We advocated things that were inconsistent with our values, and we failed to advocate for things that would have upheld our values. And I think tax is one of the most glaring examples of that. We were right to recognise that it was a meagre and miserly tax cut, but that
Mm.
doesn't matter. The Liberal Party, core of who we are, core in our DNA, is to stand for lower taxes. And we not only voted against a tax cut, we went to an election on the promise to overturn that tax cut, to effectively repeal it. And it allowed Labor to make an audacious claim that they were the party of lower taxes. And it did disappoint and confuse a lot of our supporters. And really, it is important in politics to meet people's expectations of who you are, because frankly, they don't trust you if you're talking about things that are not in line with their deeply held beliefs about your parties. They have very strong brand associations with political parties, and when you depart from that, it confuses people and makes them question what it is that you actually stand for. We can't afford to make that mistake again.
So you had the job as coalition spokesman every day. You were quite a trooper, James Paterson. I don't think I saw you ever make a mistake, in contrast to one of your other colleagues who made lots of mistakes on the campaign and subsequently been dumped from the front bench. But did you voice these concerns internally? You had a particularly unique and powerful position because you were so close to the former leader, Peter Dutton. Did you kind of at every point say, look, I think we're going down the wrong path here on tax? I mean, economics is something that you got into politics to do. So where was your influence or thinking on this issue during the campaign?
I don't want to breach private confidences and disclose private conversations, but I was concerned at the time that we took the wrong positions on those issues, and I did provide that feedback. But often it is the case that you don't win the day, and particularly on issues like tax and the economy that were outside my then portfolio responsibilities of Home Affairs. I wasn't able to win the day on those questions. And with hindsight, I should have pushed harder than I did. I should have been more vocal than I was. I should have questioned more. And I think all of my colleagues feel that with the benefit of hindsight. We ruthlessly pursued unity and discipline at the exclusion of all else. And it's not to say that we shouldn't be united and we shouldn't be disciplined. You have to be in a modern communications environment, but not to such an extent that you don't have those robust policy debates and you make sure, frankly, that they're fit for public consumption before they're released.
Do you regret putting Peter Dutton into the leadership? He turned out to be an astonishingly poor performer. I've known Peter Dutton for many years, and I was really surprised at just how badly he performed when it came to it.
No, I don't regret it at all. Peter is a good person, a good and decent person. And although it's true that he didn't come across in the public at large in the way that people who know him well understand him, I still think it was the right person to put forward in the time. What we also failed to anticipate and prepare for adequately is the implications of the Trump effect on our domestic politics. Had we had a different president in the White House, were we at a different point in history, I think the election would have been much closer. We may still have lost. We probably still would have lost. But the Trump effect really amplified our loss because Australians saw what happened in that Zelensky meeting in the White House and and with the tariffs, a type of conservatism that they wanted nothing to do with. And unfortunately, in some ways, my party lent into those comparisons rather than put distance between ourselves and Trump's Republican Party.
That is very interesting. I agree. I think Trump was probably the difference of 10 seats. I thought it would be a landslide for Labor. I thought it would be a strong result, but I thought around 84, not 94. 94 is a staggering amount. And I do think the Trump effect was something that blessed Labor at this point in time. But they also capitalized on it and you didn't. And the other thing you didn't do was preempt any sort of attack here, which really surprised me. And then, as you say, lent in. Where did you lean in the most, do you think, that was so dangerous in the
Uh,
public's
there was
mind?
some There were some loose comments here and there from shadow ministers and front benchers in the lead up to the election that were able to be weaponised by the Labor Party effectively in the campaign. I think some colleagues were very excited by President Trump's victory in November, either because they get caught up in US politics and follow it very closely, or because they thought there'd be similar implications for our country. But I know the United States very well. Like a lot of people on the centre right, I admire it greatly. But the United States is in a different point in its history than Australia is, and the kind of politics that works there does not work here. We're a very different country, even though we're also an English-speaking democracy. And if we're uncertain about that, just look at what happened in Canada. Their
Mm.
Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, one of the most exciting Conservative leaders in the world today, was absolutely smashed, having been more than 20 points ahead in the polls. And it is primarily because he was seen to be too close to Donald Trump. And that's a warning for all of us. We didn't lose quite as much as Pierre did, but we lost a lot. And had we tried to replicate this anywhere else in the English speaking world, like New Zealand or United Kingdom or anywhere else, I suspect you'd have the same result.
Do you think this is a deliberate tactic from Trump? I noticed on the day of the Canadian election, he put out another one of his tweets about the 51st state. And at that point in time, everybody knows that Trump is having an effect on the Canadian Conservatives. They know that it's been strangling Polyev. That was an act of, in my view, sabotage from a right wing. And I say that with air quotes, a right wing brother. And then after the election in Australia, he came out and said he'd never heard of Peter Dutton. He had no idea who that guy was. It doesn't seem like Trump is really a fellow traveller.
I have honestly no idea what President Trump's motivations are, and we're all guessing really. But I think we should take him at his word when he talks about America first. I think he really doesn't have much regard for the implications of his comments in other democracies on the centre right. I don't think he stays up at night and worries about whether fellow sister parties of the Republican Party in the English-speaking world are winning or losing elections. So I think he's very sincerely truthful and he means it when he says America first.
Mm. How do you operate and thrive in the shadow of MAGA?
I think that's actually straightforward. It won't necessarily be easy, but it's straightforward. We have to articulate a very clear vision for the future that is consistent with Australia's values and the Liberal Party's values here. A classically liberal agenda and vision for our country and how it will be more prosperous, more free and stronger under a Liberal national government if we win the next election. And the more that we articulate our own agenda and the more ambitious and bold that our own agenda is, the more likely it is that people will be casting their vote on the basis of that, not on something happening on the other side of the world. The risk of running a small target strategy is that you let other people define what the choices are in the election rather than you defining it. And I would much rather define it ourselves.
Mm, I think that happened with your leader too, Peter Dutton. He was very much defined in the end by Labor's attacks on him. A lot of it, of course, he made himself vulnerable to. There was an interesting line that Tony Abbott, the former Prime Minister of and leader of the Liberal Party, wrote in The Australian on the weekend. And he said that Labor attacked Peter Dutton's looks as well. Do you think that was a factor?
I hate to think that it was, but we probably should be really dispassionate and honest about this and say that there are some superficial elements of modern politics that image does matter and it does have an influence. And people form, it's a human characteristic that we form instant assessments of people in the first few seconds that we see them or meet them or hear from them. And unfortunately, probably image does have a big impact. What we failed to do as a party, though, is invest in Peter's story, invest in Peter's image, invest in sharing it with the Australian people earlier. There were people in focus groups late in the campaign who were asking questions like, Is Peter Dutton married? Does Peter Dutton have children? And even after being shown one of our campaign ads telling Peter's stories, it would say things like, "Oh, I didn't know Peter Dutton used to be a cop." So when, after 20 years in life, people don't know that Peter Dutton used to be a police officer, that is a real wake-up call for politicians that the public at large is not following elections and politicians in detail. And if you don't tell your own story, someone else will, and it won't be on favourable terms.
I am astonished of all the things you said. That astonishes me. I mean, Dutto has been a huge figure on the Australian political landscape, like or love him, for a long, long time. So I wonder whose job that was. Was it Peter Dutton, the opposition leader's office, or was it a campaign headquarters issue? I was surprised to see the first kind of, I guess, fluffy soft video come out, I think, mid-campaign. I remember talking to you, one of the few occasions I got to set eyes on you during that campaign. I asked you a question in a press conference outside one of the debates, and you said, well, there's plenty of time for our policies still. And I kind of, in the back of my head, thought, what's he smoking? People aren't paying attention. You have to do a lot of this work a lot earlier. And that, I think, was true. So whose job do you think it was to get all these messages out, particularly when it comes to Peter Dutton's own story?
On election night, Peter stood up in a very gracious way and took responsibility for the campaign and for our term as opposition. And it was a decent thing for a decent man to do, but it is a collective failure and we all bear responsibility for it. It's a failure that he and his office accept, but it's one that the parliamentary party must also accept. Our campaign headquarters must also accept our polling, our advertising. When you have a loss this bad, it's never just one thing or one person. It is lots of things going wrong. And definitely the decision not to better introduce him to the Australian people was problematic. But the other, which you referred to, is our failure to articulate our policy agenda earlier was a big problem. People don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to absorb complex policy in a short window of time. They'll probably only remember a few things that you propose. So you better propose a couple of big things that is relevant to them in their lives that will improve their personal circumstances and that they can understand and remember well before the campaign.
So one of the biggest things you did introduce, actually, it goes against all the things we've been saying, was nuclear.
Mm.
Now, when you introduced this, I think there were a lot of people in Australia. I mean, you saw this in the Labor Party. They were like, yoo-hoo, this is a brilliant tactic. This is going to completely backfire. Everyone's worried about Fukushima waste running through Australia. And they were releasing stupid things like three-eyed fish memes. I took the other approach. I thought this is a really daring move. It is something that will make people look at you because you're proposing something that's long term and something that takes a bit of political courage to do because nuclear's been such a taboo issue in Australia. And you did get seemingly rewarded for that for a while, but then you seemed to vacate the field. So even when you did have a policy that you could have argued for, you didn't. What happened? And do you think you trash nuclear now that you can't go forward with it? Or do you think nuclear is still something you can resurrect and keep on the table?
One of the critiques of us that I don't accept is that we did run a small target strategy or a low risk strategy that was a high risk strategy to embrace nuclear energy and to take it to the people from opposition. It was a hugely ambitious thing to do, and we did it not based on any polling or research, but because we agreed that it was in the national interest. And Peter particularly believed it was in the national interest, and I agreed with him. The problem with that, though, is because it was so complex and so ambitious, it took an enormous amount of time and energy of the limited resources of an opposition to really invest in that policy to make it as bulletproof as possible, to anticipate every criticism and have an answer for it. That I think that contributed to the lack of policy development in other areas. So much of our scarce resources were taken up on nuclear that it means that we didn't have the time and energy for other big policy ideas. And in a way, we put all of our eggs in one basket. And Labor was able to demonise it primarily because we took the strategy that it should be government owned and government built with the private sector, but ultimately that government finance it. And that opened the door for their $600 billion scare campaign in a way that if we had instead just said we were going to repeal the
Mm.
moratorium, would not have given rise to that scare campaign. Perhaps other scare campaigns might have been run, but not that one. And so that is something that we're now looking at very closely.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't appreciated that. So there's a bit of flexibility about how you go about it this time. I must say, as someone who went into politics for liberal economics, you must be thinking, huh, why would the government be in the business of building nuclear plants across Australia? That's a bizarre position to me for you guys to hold.
Yeah, it was all about de-risking it in the public's mind that they would have confidence that it would be run well and be looked at closely. But it was in some ways inconsistent with liberal values that we should be allowing investors and the market and the energy industry to determine the exact mix of energy, not the government, and that what the government should do is facilitate that by lifting this moratorium that we have. So a more market-based solution would be to go down that route.
Is this an example of where your junior coalition party, the Nationals, who you briefly had a bit of a breakup with, I guess it's a lover's tiff, but then they decided they want to back in on the marriage after all. Perhaps the kids were too important to them. And so they're now back in the coalition after a couple of days out. But because of the absolute carnage at the ballot box you suffered, and not just this election, but the last election too, you've had this real dearth of moderate voices in the Liberal Party for some time now, and an outweighing of coalition views in terms of those represented by the regions and Queensland particularly. Do you think that they have had too much say in the shape of the Liberal Party and that has stopped you from appealing to Middle Australia? And how do you counter that in the future?
If that's the thesis, I don't think nuclear power is a good point of evidence to prove it because nuclear was embraced across the coalition party
The
room
the
just as
government
much
the
by
government
Liberals.
funding, I think, I guess, is more the difference, not the idea
Yeah,
of nuclear.
sure. I think that was a mistake to make go down that pathway and say we're going to have government-run power plants, and I think a more market-based approach could have been preferable and may well be the choice that we make in this parliamentary term. But I don't think that was dictated by the National Party per se. I think it was kind of a political risk management strategy. More broadly on that question, I think that analysis sometimes fails to appreciate that the Liberal Party represents just as much as regional Australia as the National Party does, and we aspire to represent all Australians, including people living in regional remote Australia. And frankly, the views of a regional Liberal are not that different to that of most Nationals. They're quite similar because of the constituencies that they represent. So this idea that divorced from the National Party, we would all of a sudden become a party of the cities and the suburbs ignores the fact that we hold a lot of regional seats and those regional members would continue to have a big say in our policy platform too, in a way that wouldn't be that distinctive from a national. There might be some differences of emphasis and degree and philosophy, but not such a massive difference as sometimes is articulated.
Mm, okay. So what's the future for the Liberals? And I want to be a little bit more specific than just standing for Liberal values. You have an enormous challenge. You're only, I think it's one or two MPs in city seats now. It's extraordinary. When I lived in Sydney, that northern side of Sydney was just dominated by the Liberal Party. So to see that completely destroyed is phenomenal. And we really can't understate what that means for the Liberals. How do you rebuild from here? What policy focus do you take? And also, what needs to happen inside your party to make it more competitive?
Mm. Australia is one of the most urbanised democracies in the English-speaking world. Australians live in cities and along our coast. They do not live in the centre of Australia. And that's why we're very different from other Western democracies like the United States that have a massive interior and a significant population in that interior. So there is no future for the Liberal Party unless we are competitive in our cities and our suburbs. And there is no pathway to government that only goes through the regions and remote Australia. So it's critical that we have an entry in those areas. The encouraging thing about this devastating result is, even despite a very bad national campaign that was a negative weight on those campaigns, we won some inner city seats, including Goldstein. We got a swing to us in Kooyong. It demonstrates that the Teals can be defeated. And imagine how much better we would do if we backed those candidates in better and had a national policy agenda that was more attuned to those seats. Our first task at the next election will be to win back seats that we have traditionally held, like the Menzies and Deacons
Mm.
of the world, and to build on that and hopefully take back the Kooyongs and other Teal seats as well, while also targeting the suburbs and the traditional marginal seats like a Chisholm or a McEwen.
And how? I mean, what's the offering you give them that's different to Labor that gets people looking at you and saying, you have something that makes me believe in the future of this country?
The main reason why people vote for the Liberal Party is that we give them hope for their own personal and family aspiration. They think if they vote Liberal and they work hard, they'll be better off. And we need to restore that hope for the future, particularly economic hope for the future, with quite an ambitious economic agenda that gives them confidence that themselves and their children will be better off under us and inspires them to vote for us. And that will require some tough choices on the budget side to make sure we're having very disciplined budget management, that we can deliver the surpluses that we need, but also that we can reward people for their effort by reducing their taxes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the other surprising things that you guys did in the last campaign was just match all this high spending from Labor and then come out and propose more high spending on things that the Liberals should be caring about, like defence and national security. But it was so late in the game and it was so non credible because you couldn't really say where the sums would add up. So, did you lose your way? What, after the financial crisis? Was it after COVID where you just start as a Liberal Party saying, yep, high spending is something we now back. Debts and deficit is not something we care about anymore. It's all fine, but we can keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. And is that the kind of point where if you become Labor light, what's the point of the Liberals anymore?
I understand the choices that had to be made in the pandemic during the Morrison government, but I remember being uneasy about them at the time as a classical Liberal and worrying about what that would do in the medium and long term to our brand. And the truth is, if we get into a system of politics in Australia that is a competition about who can be more generous and who can hand out more money, the Liberal Party will lose that fight every time. And ultimately, I think Australia will be far worse off. The idea that we're ever going to win in auction politics, where we outbid Labor by being more generous, is not the path to political success for us. So we're going to have to articulate some honest conversations about the choices that Australians face. That if you want the services, the endless services that you're being promised, that they have to be paid for, that it's not sustainable to be running big budget deficits and to be racking up debt, and that we have to make some choices. And the Liberal Party, frankly, has to be the adult in the room, being willing to treat the Australian public with respect and be honest about that, rather than pretending that it's just all free, that there's no costs and no consequences.
And you're going to have to prepare for an almighty scare campaign next election if that's the truth, because that will expose you to another. The Liberals will come and cut healthcare. They will come and cut anything that you care about that gets you through the door in the day. So I really hope you're prepared for that. Just
Yes,
finally,
but just on that quickly, Labor Party run a scare campaign anyway. They ran a scare campaign at this election when we're matching all their spending. So if they're going to run a scare campaign, well, we might as well be clarified about what the choice is for the Australian people so they understand what our offering is.
no, I agree. I agree. And I don't think, by the way, that the public is not ready for a bit of an economic conversation. Two final questions. What do you think the battle lines are for the next 3 years in Australia as it navigates its own economic situation, but also the global climate? Where do you think Labor will be most vulnerable, and where would you be looking to really attack Labor? And the final question is, I interviewed, I think, maybe someone who you might describe as a mentor, but certainly an inspiration for you in politics, Nick Minchin, a couple of weeks ago for the Nightly, and he was very interesting. He's a right-wing power broker, I guess someone you might model yourself in his own image. And he has now said he is open to something like quotas because he realises that the Liberals have just not been able to garner female candidates and subsequently the female vote in the way that Labor has.
Look, on the economy and the big issues over the next 3 years, I suspect the next election is going to be very different to this election in that hopefully the cost of living pressures that have been so acute over the last 3 years abates. Global inflation and interest rates are coming down, and hopefully we don't have an inflation crisis like what we've had over the last few years again. So instead, they'll be fought on different issues. I suspect, given the really significant volatility in international policy led by the United States with their tariffs, that a sovereign debt crisis is not an unforeseeable event. Hopefully not likely, but not unforeseeable. And if you look at what is happening right now in Japanese bond markets in particular, where they have very few buyers for their long-term bonds on the 20, 30, and 40-year horizon, or even US Treasury bonds, which are now fetching over 5% for the 10-year bond rate, that is a warning sign for all of us that the stable fiscal environment and monetary policy environment that we've largely enjoyed since over the last 20 years is not guaranteed over the next few years. And we do need to prepare for that. If that's right, then what we should be doing right now is restoring our fiscal buffers, getting our budget back into shape, and getting ready for a fiscal or economic crisis, which is exact opposite of what Labor is doing. They're turning surpluses into deficits and they're racking up more debt. So that will be my laser-like focus for the next few years. And I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that crisis doesn't eventuate. On Nick Minchin, yes, candidly, he's a political hero of mine. I have always looked up to Nick, and he's a wise elder of our party who should be listened to. I'm cautious about quotas, not just because of a philosophical reservation about it, but because of a pretty fundamental and practical one. The Liberal Party is a decentralised democratic party. We choose our candidates in a democratic process locally. And the only way you could introduce quotas in lower house seats anyway is for there to be either no democracy or no decentralisation. You would have to be imposed centrally, it would have to be imposed from the top, you would have to take away the right of members to choose their candidates. You'd have to say, in this seat, you can only pick a female candidate so that we meet a quota. And I think the likelihood of Liberal Party branch members voting to amend their constitutions to allow that to happen is close to zero. What we should focus on is, yes, getting more women into Parliament by means that are more easily available to us. I've long been attracted to the A-list system that David Cameron pioneered and the Tories in the United Kingdom, where we identify quality people in the community, we support them, we train them, we vet them, and then we offer them to members as a highly capable candidate who you should give great weight to and listen to in the pre-selection. And I think that way you'll drive more uptake of not just women, but people in other categories that are not well represented in the Liberal Party, including multicultural communities.
James Paterson, I can see why Susan Ley moved you from a national security brief, which you certainly acquitted with great aplomb, into a finance one. Does it feel right to be returning to your first home of economics?
Yeah, it is an exciting challenge. I'm really looking forward to it. In politics, it's great to be able to learn new things and have new intellectual challenges. And economics is something I've always been very passionate about. My interest in national security is undiminished, and unfortunately, the grave security environment we face hasn't gone away. But you've got to be able to pay for it, and you only pay for that if there's good economic management. I hope to lead that conversation.
Thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Burke. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.